Coal became a prominent source of energy in the 1700s during the Industrial Revolution, as it provided much more energy than wood burning or animal labor. Coal mining is a very physically demanding job with many health hazards, and the coal workers, along with basically all other workers during the Industrial Revolution, such as railway workers and dock workers, were exploited and paid very low wages with few benefits and little political say to change that. There was a population migration from rural areas to cities and towns. As you can see from the map, the greatest population dense areas are the ones located close to the coal fields, principal canals, and railway. You can follow along the chains of the energy industry, connecting the coal mines with the railways, with the ports, with the people in the cities. It is from this newly interconnected world that gave rise to a new kind of political power. Thanks to this coal chain, the workers could manipulate and control the flow of energy. The coal miners realized their important role and started going on strikes to have their voices heard. During a strike, the mines were unable to produce any coal as there are no workers. Thus, no one else can get coal and electricity. Whole cities were affected by this abrupt halt, and those in charge of the cities and industries, usually one and the same, rushed to find out any way to get the system going again.
Workers used their new powers over energy flows to acquire or extend the right to vote, and more importantly, the right to form labor unions, to create political organizations, and to take collective action, including strikes.
General strikes started flourishing, in which the different workers on the chain joined together and went on strike. The shipping, coal, railways, dock workers would be in communication and unite and cause particularly intense damage, freezing the whole chain. The worker had gained a new political consciousness that created democracy in which every man can be heard. Of course, the wealthy businessmen couldn't let this go on for much longer. The Rockefeller Plan, enacted after the Ludlow Massacre of 1914, started to change the power of the people by creating company unions. It allowed workers to negotiate overpay and working conditions, while preventing them from joining independent unions. Europe was overwhelmed with the growing number and intensity of strikes, in addition to just finishing World War II, and turned to the US for help. Marshall Plan was used to promote the new industrial model prioritizing productivity. The help from the Marshall Plan was only given to countries which also accepted economic changes, starting with the coal industry. The US shifted Europe's dependence on coal and built an energy system based on oil. Conveniently, the US led Europe towards Saudi oil fields, which were controlled by the American companies and the US government. By doing so, this permanently weakened the coal miners, as the world loves oil now, not coal. Energy consumption graphs show this decrease of coal and increase in oil during that time. Oil would bring about a new political system, very different than the one that coal built, which truly gave power to the people. In the age of coal, oil held a secondary role. Its main usage was for lighting, in the form of kerosene. Oil was widely distributed in small amounts, and so, in the 20th century, the use of kerosene lamps diminished because of increasing electrification. What then should the oil companies do? They found a new use for oil. Oil was now used as a source of mechanical power in the case of the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine spread rapidly after 1900, but more importantly, it gave oil a use. This is because there was no substitute for oil in the engine. You couldn't power the engine with coal.
Today, engines of all types and sizes are in large-scale production throughout the world. Medium-speed engines for express trains, small high-speed engines for trucks and buses, diesels for tractors and bulldozers and agricultural machines, miniature engines for model cars and model aircraft, huge double-acting types for generating electrical power and for driving ships, two-stroke and four-stroke engines for 100 uses.
If you notice, petroleum usage increases starting around the 1900s. In 1913, Henry Ford expanded on the assembly line to make his production of the Model T more efficient. Severe spike in the 1920s, which is about when more firms started mass production lines such as Cadillac, Pontiac, and Chevrolet. Robert Moses created the highways, paved the road for American dependence on fossil fuel. Compared to coal, oil production required a smaller workforce in relation to the quantity of energy produced. This is because oil transportation could be done with less human labor. For example, pumping stations and pipelines could replace railways as means of transporting energy from the site of production to the places where it was used or shipped abroad. Oil pipelines were invented as a means of reducing the ability of humans to interrupt the flow of energy. The fluidity and lightness of oil means it is able to be shipped in large quantities across oceans. Most importantly, transoceanic shipping operated beyond the territorial spaces governed by the labor regulations and other democratic rights won in the era of widespread coal and railway strikes. Shipping companies could escape the regulation of labor laws and avoid paying their taxes by registering their vessels in Panama. This removed whatever limited powers of labor organizing might have remained. This led to the first giant oil spill, the Torrey Canyon disaster off the coast of Cornwall. This was one of the triggers of the emergence of the environmental movement, but it also weakened powers of local forces that tried to control sites of energy production. Because if a labor strike or nationalization of an industry affected one production site, oil tankers could be quickly routed to supply oil from alternative sites. Oil companies would introduce small delays, interruptions, and controls by limiting the flow of energy would enhance their control.
The goal is to place themselves in control of the conduits, processing points, and bottlenecks through which oil had to flow, to restrict the development of rival channels, beginning with the oil wells themselves, and to use this command of obligatory passage points to convert the flow of oil into profits.
Mitchell introduces a term called the technological zone, which is a set of coordinated but widely dispersed regulations, calculative arrangements, infrastructures, and technical procedures that render certain objects or flows governable. Saudi Arabia's alliance with the United States was not serendipitous, but the result of two primary factors: the country's autocratic power structure and its vital role in the system of scarcity. The efforts of Ibn Saud in the early 20th century helped to establish an almost medieval governmental structure within Saudi Arabia. The Saud family relies upon cooperation between the government and Islamic fundamentalists in order to maintain power. Within Saudi Arabia, the religious establishment created the moral and legal order and imposed the strict social regime that maintained discipline in the subject population and suppressed political dissent. As Mitchell points out, the more closely a government is allied with Washington, the more Islamic its politics. Regimes that draw their power from religion give the United States an actor that they can work with. In 1971, President Nixon destabilized the world's confidence in the dollar by pulling out of the Bretton Woods Accord and abandoning the gold exchange standard.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world.
In 1974, in an effort to renew confidence in the dollar, Nixon struck a deal with the government of Saudi Arabia to ensure that the oil trade was denominated by the US dollar. The framework for the deal was pretty simple. The US would buy oil from Saudi Arabia and provide the kingdom military aid and equipment. In return, the Saudis would plow billions of their petrodollar revenue back into treasuries and finance America's spending. This arrangement helped to establish an alliance between the United States and Saudi Arabia for decades to come. The extent to which the values of the United States have been corrupted as a result of its relationship with Saudi Arabia can be seen in the United States' response to the civil war in Yemen. The conflict in Yemen is a bundle of human rights violations, particularly on the part of Saudi Arabia. The Saudi coalition's blockade and airstrikes are a chief source of civilian suffering, keeping millions from accessing basic of food, medicine, and clean water they desperately need. What makes this conflict worse is that Saudi Arabia's intervention in Yemen would not be possible without the aid of the United States. The civil war in Yemen is really a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Iranian support for Houthi rebels in Yemen is a strategic maneuver by the Iranian government to bog down Saudi Arabia in a conflict that is costing the kingdom around $200 million a day. By establishing itself in Yemen, it completes not only the encirclement of Saudi Arabia, but also control of the strategic Bab al-Mandab Strait, where more than 1/3 of the world's oil supply passes on a daily basis. Maintain control of its own country and its position as a regional power in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia depends on military aid from the United States. According to a Congressional Research Service study, under Obama, the overall sales pending delivery of equipment and specialized training for troops to Saudi Arabia alone ballooned to $115 billion. The arms deal made by the Obama administration and the continuation of that deal under Trump are precisely for the purpose of intervening in Yemen. It seems under President Trump, the future of relations between the Saudi Arabia and United States look bright. In return for the support of the United States, Saudi Arabia will allocate a significant portion of its assets in foreign investments, primarily in the United States. The promises made by both the United States and Saudi Arabia will continue a decades-long contentious relationship.